December 29, 1944, Versailles. Dwight D. Eisenhower reads the same telegram for the third time. It is not a request. It is not advice. It is an ultimatum. The sender is Bernard Montgomery. The demand is absolute, complete control of all Allied ground forces. If Eisenhower refuses, Montgomery will bypass him entirely, appealing directly to Churchill and the combined chiefs of staff. This is not disagreement. This is a coup attempt disguised as military correspondence. Eisenhower places the telegram on his desk, stands, and walks to the window. Outside, winter grips Versailles. Frost clings to the glass. The grounds are silent. He stands there, motionless, for what witnesses later estimate as 5 full minutes. When he turns back, the expression on his face is something his staff has never seen before. Not anger, not frustration, resolve. Because Eisenhower understands the truth with absolute clarity. If he yields now, his authority as Supreme Commander will no longer exist in any meaningful sense. The question is no longer how to manage Montgomery. The question is whether Eisenhower will remain Supreme Commander at all. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Late afternoon. Staff officers move through the corridors quietly, instinctively aware that something fundamental has shifted. In the operations room, maps still display the Ardennes salient. American and German forces locked in brutal combat as the Bulge slowly contracts. But here in Versailles, the real battle is about command. The fracture between Eisenhower and Montgomery did not begin today. It had been widening since September 1, 1944, when Eisenhower assumed direct command of all Allied ground forces. Until then, Montgomery had commanded Allied ground forces during the Normandy invasion. He believed, on both professional and national grounds, that he should retain that role permanently. Throughout the autumn of 1944, Montgomery pressed relentlessly for a single narrow thrust into northern Germany under his command, rejecting Eisenhower's broad front strategy. In September, he championed Operation Market Garden, a massive airborne assault intended to seize bridges across the Rhine. Even Montgomery's own chief of staff expressed private doubts. The operation failed catastrophically at Arnhem. By October, Montgomery was insisting through back channels that he outranked Omar Bradley and should command all Allied ground forces. Eisenhower absorbed the pressure. He reorganized subordinate commands, compromised on operational details, and preserved unity, while holding on to his authority. In November, Montgomery crossed another line. He sent a letter so sharply critical of Eisenhower's leadership that Francis de Guingamp flew personally to Versailles, recognizing that the alliance itself was nearing rupture. Each confrontation followed the same pattern. Montgomery demanded, Eisenhower contained. The alliance survived, but the cost was rising. American commanders grew increasingly resentful. Bradley, in particular, seethed at what he viewed as British arrogance enabled by American restraint. Eisenhower's own deputy, Arthur Tedder, openly discussed the possibility of relieving Montgomery. Then came the Ardennes. December 16, 1944, 0530 hours. German forces under Gerd von Rundstedt launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. 3 German armies attacked across an 80-mile front held by 4 American divisions. The assault split 1st Army and 9th Army, severing communications with Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters. On December 20th, Eisenhower made a decision he knew would be politically explosive. He temporarily placed 1st and 9th Armies under Montgomery's operational control. Militarily, the logic was sound. Montgomery's headquarters was closer to the northern shoulder of the penetration. Bradley's headquarters had lost contact with units north of the Bulge. Montgomery could restore coordination faster. Bradley understood the necessity, but later wrote that the decision burned like acid in his throat. What he anticipated was Montgomery's response. Montgomery accepted the temporary command with barely concealed satisfaction. De Guingamp recorded that he practically glowed when the order arrived. Within 24 hours, Montgomery was reorganizing American units, redirecting supply columns, and issuing orders that contradicted existing American dispositions. Courtney Hodges reacted visibly. His aide later recorded Hodges' words, "He's acting like he's just conquered us, not the Germans." And now, 9 days later, Montgomery had decided not to give the command back. He wanted everything, and Eisenhower was done yielding. But Montgomery was not just repositioning forces. He was constructing a narrative in which the Battle of the Bulge represented American failure, one that required British intervention to correct. In communications to London, Montgomery immediately began describing the Ardennes offensive in terms that minimized American resistance and maximized British rescue. In meetings with British officers and war correspondents, he portrayed U.S. forces as having been caught unprepared through incompetence. John Whiteley, Deputy Chief of Staff at Supreme Headquarters, watched with growing alarm. He later stated that Montgomery was rewriting history in real time. The reality was very different. Yes, German forces achieved tactical surprise. Yes, American units were pushed back from their initial positions. But at critical points, American forces fought with desperate effectiveness that blunted the German offensive. At St. Vith, the U.S. 7th Armored Division held for 6 days against overwhelming odds, buying crucial time for Allied reserves to deploy. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division refused surrender despite complete encirclement. These were not failures requiring rescue. They were American tactical successes that turned the operational tide of the battle. Before Montgomery ever assumed operational control, the German offensive had already been checked. Whether Montgomery failed to grasp this reality or chose to ignore it remains unclear. What is clear is that his version of events served British political interests. It positioned him as the indispensable commander whose experience had saved inexperienced Americans from disaster. By late December, this narrative was spreading rapidly through British military and political circles and reaching London newspapers. At Supreme Headquarters, American officers began receiving reports that British accounts were crediting Montgomery with turning the battle. The anger was immediate and intense. Harry Butcher, Eisenhower's naval aide, recorded the mounting fury inside American command circles. Yet Eisenhower, ever the coalition diplomat, attempted to contain the damage quietly through careful messages and back-channel communications. Then, Montgomery made it public. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery held a press conference at his headquarters in Zonhoven, Belgium. For more than an hour, he spoke without notes to assembled war correspondents. He described the Battle of the Bulge as one of the most difficult and interesting battles he had ever handled. He spoke of how he had taken personal command, employed the full power of the British Army Group, and seen the situation as a whole. Montgomery praised American soldiers as brave fighting men. He called Eisenhower the captain of the team and declared himself absolutely devoted to Ike. But the structure of the briefing told a different story. The repeated use of I, the framing of British intervention as decisive, the implication that American errors required British correction. The message was unmistakable. Montgomery had saved the Americans from themselves. Word reached Supreme Headquarters within hours. Butcher recorded that he had never seen Eisenhower that angry. His face went from red to purple. Eisenhower said Montgomery had just claimed credit for the entire operation, while American soldiers were still dying in the Ardennes forests. Even then, Eisenhower chose restraint. But that restraint was about to end. Eisenhower sent carefully worded messages to Montgomery, warning that such public statements risked damaging Allied unity. Kenneth Strong, intelligence chief at Supreme Headquarters, later observed that Eisenhower was performing a miracle of patience. Any other commander, he said, would have relieved Montgomery immediately. Eisenhower understood the stakes. Dismissing a British field marshal could fracture the alliance itself. So once again, he absorbed the insult and managed the crisis rather than escalating it. This pattern was not new. Since September 1944, after the liberation of France, Montgomery had demanded all Allied resources for a single narrow thrust into Germany under his command. Eisenhower refused, insisting on the broad front strategy. Montgomery appealed to Churchill. Eisenhower held firm, then compromised on resources in October. When Montgomery claimed he outranked Bradley and should command all American ground forces, Eisenhower deflected the demand through reorganization, preserving command relationships while adjusting operational boundaries. In November came the private letter, so insulting in its assessment of Eisenhower's strategic competence that Francis de Guingamp flew to Versailles to prevent an irreparable break. Each time, Eisenhower contained the damage and preserved the alliance. Each time, the cost rose. Brigadier General Arthur Nevins, who worked in operations at Supreme Headquarters, later wrote that everyone watched Eisenhower carry the burden. Montgomery would make impossible demands. criticize American leadership, claim unearned credit, and Eisenhower would simply take it. The question was how long he could continue. American tolerance was not infinite. By December 1944, senior commanders openly questioned why Eisenhower continued to shield Montgomery. Bradley's resentment was visceral. George Patton referred to Montgomery in private correspondence with open contempt. Even within Supreme Headquarters, patience had run out. Still, Eisenhower held the line, convinced that coalition unity required it. Then the telegram arrived, December 29, 1944. Supreme Headquarters. This communication was different. It was not a request. It was not a suggestion. It was an ultimatum. Montgomery wrote that the existing command structure was quite unworkable. There must be a single commander for all ground forces, he insisted, with authority from Switzerland to the North Sea. He demanded that Eisenhower grant him this authority immediately. If Eisenhower refused, Montgomery stated he would take the matter directly to Prime Minister Churchill and the combined chiefs of staff, where he was confident British military opinion would support him. The threat was explicit, calculated, a direct attempt to bypass Eisenhower and force a change through political pressure. Colonel James Galt, the British liaison at Supreme Headquarters, immediately recognized what had happened. Montgomery had overplayed his hand. He believed he held all the cards. He did not realize he had just declared war on Eisenhower's command authority. The telegram was, in essence, a military coup attempt disguised as professional disagreement. Eisenhower read it 3 times. Then he stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the winter landscape for nearly 5 minutes. When Eisenhower turned back to his desk, his expression had changed. He called for his chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith. What followed would decide whether Eisenhower remained supreme commander or became a figurehead mediating between rival national interests. Smith arrived within minutes. Eisenhower was already drafting a response. This was not another diplomatic deflection. The draft was blunt. Eisenhower wrote that Montgomery's attitude had become intolerable and his demand completely unacceptable. He stated that he had referred his own position to George Marshall and the combined chiefs with a condition. They must choose between him and Montgomery. One of them would leave the European theater. He did not care which. Smith read the draft and looked up in shock. Eisenhower met his gaze steadily. He had had enough. Smith understood the moment and the risk. He persuaded Eisenhower to let him draft a parallel message to Marshall, framed so Washington could act immediately. The telegram sent that evening was professional and precise. Its meaning was unmistakable. Montgomery's demand was militarily unsound, politically impossible, and the situation now required a decision at the highest level. Either Montgomery conformed to Eisenhower's authority, or Eisenhower could not function effectively as supreme commander. Marshall received the message late on December 29th. He read it twice, then called Ernest King and Henry Arnold. Within an hour, the Joint Chiefs assembled. Marshall laid it out plainly. Eisenhower was prepared to resign. Montgomery had to back down. The discussion was brief. King was blunt. Support Eisenhower, period. If the British wanted Montgomery in command, they could run their own war. Arnold agreed. Eisenhower had carried Montgomery for months. If Montgomery could not serve under an American commander, he had to go. Marshall drafted a reply immediately, but he went further. Recognizing this required political resolution, he called the White House and requested an urgent meeting with Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt's response was direct. Eisenhower stays, Montgomery obeys, or he is finished. Call Churchill and make the American position absolute. There would be no compromise on command authority. The telegram from Washington reached London in the early hours of December 30th. Winston Churchill read it and immediately grasped the stakes. "Good God," he said. "Eisenhower has actually done it." Churchill knew Britain could not win this fight. By December 1944, American divisions outnumbered British and Canadian forces in Europe. American logistics sustained the theater. American industry supplied the war. A rupture would cost Britain far more than pride, possibly post-war influence itself. Churchill summoned Alan Brooke. Brooke argued Montgomery was tactically right. Churchill cut him off. Tactical correctness was irrelevant. Forcing a change in command by threatening a superior was insubordination. Defending it would cost Britain Eisenhower and American cooperation. That morning, Churchill drafted his own message, polite, unmistakable. Montgomery was to back down immediately. Montgomery received Churchill's directive and the implicit threat in Eisenhower's appeal to higher authority. By then, his chief of staff, Francis de Guingamp, already understood the reality. The line had been crossed. The decision had been made. Montgomery was told to retreat immediately, not only because Churchill ordered it, but because he had miscalculated. He believed the Americans needed him more than he needed them. He was wrong. What followed was one of the fastest reversals in military correspondence. On December 30th, Montgomery sent a telegram to Dwight D. Eisenhower. Its tone was conciliatory, almost apologetic. Montgomery wrote that he was distressed Eisenhower was troubled and urged him to put the matter out of his mind. He declared himself absolutely devoted to Eisenhower's service and his most loyal subordinate. The telegram walked back every implication of his earlier demands. Whatever Eisenhower decided, Montgomery would support it wholeheartedly. If the existing command arrangements remained unchanged, he would accept them without reservation. He closed by stressing, almost desperately, that he was under Eisenhower's command and would remain so. That point had never truly been in question, but the damage was done. On January 1, 1945, Eisenhower issued new command directives. 1st and 9th Armies would return to Omar Bradley as soon as the tactical situation allowed. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would continue on the northern flank with clearly defined boundaries and objectives. Most importantly, Eisenhower made one point explicit. He exercised complete command authority over all Allied forces in the European theater. His decisions were final. The implication was unmistakable. The era of negotiating with Montgomery was over. Brigadier General Thor Smith at Supreme Headquarters noted the change immediately. Before December 29th, Montgomery could issue demands and Eisenhower would maneuver around them. Afterward, Eisenhower's response to any pressure was effectively simple: comply, or the issue goes straight to Washington. The command relationship never recovered. Eisenhower and Montgomery continued to work together through the final campaigns, but only professionally. Meetings became formal. Coordination was precise. The personal warmth vanished. Arthur Tedder later observed that before December 1944, Eisenhower would invite Montgomery to dinner and try to smooth disagreements personally. Afterward, their interactions were brief, restrained, and strictly business. Bradley was less reserved. On January 10th, he wrote to Eisenhower to thank him formally. Montgomery's conduct during the Bulge, Bradley said, had been an insult to every American soldier who fought and died in those woods. And Eisenhower had finally drawn the line. Dwight D. Eisenhower finally stood up to him. Omar Bradley later wrote that December 29th was the day Eisenhower stopped trying to make everyone happy and started commanding like the supreme commander he was meant to be. The episode revealed something essential about Eisenhower's leadership. He had often been criticized for being too political, too willing to compromise, too focused on keeping the alliance together at any cost. December 29, 1944, proved that judgment incomplete. Eisenhower was willing to compromise, up to a point. When that point was reached, he acted with decisive finality. Montgomery found the line. The lesson reaches far beyond World War II. Coalition leadership is not about pleasing everyone. It is not endless negotiation or permanent compromise. It is about creating a structure where national pride can coexist with unified command, where political concerns are acknowledged, but military necessity prevails, and where one authority must be final and defended, even at personal and political risk. Montgomery learned that lesson too late. Eisenhower had understood it all along and hoped he would never have to prove it. On December 29, 1944, he did. By drawing the line, Eisenhower did not weaken the alliance, he strengthened it. From that moment on, the Western Alliance stopped being an experiment in coalition warfare and became an established command structure with clear rules. Authority had been asserted. It would not be challenged again. If this story of leadership, command, and the moment Eisenhower drew the line resonated with you, please like this video. It really helps support this kind of in-depth history. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the decisions that shaped the war, and share this with anyone interested in military leadership and coalition warfare. And let us know in the comments, was Eisenhower right to risk the alliance to assert his authority, or should he have continued accommodating Montgomery? Also, where are you watching from? We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for watching.